Parents cared for me, did their best for me, so forth. And growing up, I took all that for granted. Until I started hearing these young people's stories. And then I realized just how very, very lucky I had been. And they made me very grateful to my family, and they made me very grateful to God for the place that God gave me in this world. Because life is a lottery, and none of us chooses where we're going to be in this world. And that changed my relationship with God. I grew up thinking God was a judge. That was the image of God that my generation were given. God is up there looking down at you, and God is noting down all the things you do wrong and noting down the things you do right. And at the end of your life, there's going to be some sort of judgment, and maybe you get into heaven and maybe you don't. Now I reject that sort of God. I reject that notion of God as a judge. And for me now, God is the giver of the gifts. God is the one who has given me and continues to give me so very, very many gifts. Big gifts, like gift of good family, good friends, good education, good health, good opportunities in life. But every day smaller gifts that God pours out. And with all those gifts comes all the love that God can pour out on us. And that's changed my whole relationship with God. And my prayer with God to God now is just thanks. Thanks for what I have received, because there just isn't anything else to say. Just thanks. So they made me very grateful. Another thing they did for me was they taught me never to judge anybody. We had a guy living with us. We can never judge anybody because we don't know what's gone on in anybody's life or in anybody's childhood. We had a guy living with us who was 17, and he was a big fellow. And every time you asked him to do something he didn't want to do, he'd throw a punch at you. Staff came to me and said, "Get rid of this guy. This fellow is off the wall. We can't work with this. Somebody's going to end up getting hurt. For God's sake, throw him out." So I said, "Okay, I'll throw him out." But before I got around to throwing him out, I was talking to him on his own one day, and he broke down crying. And he said, "You know, in my home when I was growing up, it was do this, do that, or thump, thump, thump. You got punched around the house as if you were a punch bag." And as soon as he said that, everything fell into place. When you asked him to do something he didn't want to do, who did he see in front of him? He saw his own father in front of him. And he reacted the only way he knew how to react to his father. He threw the first punch before his father could get a blow in. And once we understood that, we were able to work with him. We didn't throw him out. He lived 4 or 5 years with us and then moved on successfully to his own accommodation. There was someone we could have written off, judged, condemned, because we didn't understand where he was coming from. So they taught me never to judge anybody. It's a little phrase in the gospel which says, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged." And I always thought that meant if you go through life not judging people, then when you die and go before God, God won't judge you. But I don't think that's what it means now, because I don't think God is a judge. What does it mean? What am I doing if I were to judge one of those young people? If I was to say, "There's a little scumbag, there's a little junkie robber," what am I actually doing? I'm actually judging myself. Because I know if I had been born into their circumstances, I would be exactly the same as them. And if they had been born into my circumstances, they would be the priest coming up to visit me in prison. I didn't choose the circumstances I wanted to be born into. They didn't choose the circumstances they wanted to be born into. It could so easily have been the other way around. And therefore I look at one of these young people, maybe they're out robbing to feed their drug habit, or maybe they're sitting in a corner stoned out of their face. When I look at them, I see part of myself in them. Because there, but for the grace of God, go I. That could so easily have been me. So they taught me never to judge anybody. They've made me angry. And I'm glad to be angry. And I always say when I lose my anger, I'll be no use to them. They've made me angry because we as a society have failed them. We have failed them because they're carrying huge burdens on their shoulders from childhood, and we have prevented them from lifting those burdens off their shoulders because we haven't provided the services and the supports they need to allow them to do so. We had a guy living with us. He was 14 years of age, lovely young fella, no problem at all, till suddenly his behaviour started to deteriorate. And he started hitting the other young people he was hanging around with. So we said, this is very strange. We'd better find out what's happening, where this is coming from. So we bring him up to the child guidance clinic. They do 2 interviews with him. At the end of the second interview, they said to us, look, we know what's happened. This young fellow wasn't wanted by his family, so he was brought up by his granny. And he became very attached to his granny. And when he was 5 years of age, his granny died. And he never got over it. And now at 14, he's angry that his granny was taken away from him, and he's taking his anger out on the other young people that he's hanging around with. So they said, we can give him the counselling that he needs. The counselling will improve his behaviour, but he goes on a waiting list. The school suspended him because he was hitting the other kids in the class. But they said, we'll take him back as soon as we get the special needs teacher we've been promised, who can give him the one-to-one counselling, one-to-one attention that he needs. And the school was on a waiting list for a special needs teacher. So here you had this guy out on the street all day long, his behaviour getting worse and worse and worse, heading, if he's lucky, for a children detention school. If he's unlucky, heading for drugs and an overdose. So we said to a social worker, we need to get this guy into a high support unit. What's a high support unit? It's a special type of hostel. You're sent there by the courts, not because you've committed a criminal offence, but you're sent there for your own protection. And in this high support unit, you have all the services the young person needs. You have psychiatrists, psychologists, counsellors, teachers, everybody. So we said we need to get this young fellow into a high support unit. So the social worker made inquiries, came back and said, yes, he would be suitable for a high support unit, but he goes on a waiting list. And that makes me angry. We are failing these young people. We have an estimated minimum 15,000 heroin users in this country. How many detox beds do we have in this country for 15,000 heroin users? And the answer is 28. And that's a disgrace. Christmas before last, I buried 2 young people, both of them very well known to me. Both died of a drug overdose. One was found dead on Christmas morning. They were both on that waiting list for one of the 28 beds. But they didn't have time to wait. And so our failure to provide them with the services and supports they need is preventing them from reaching a happy, fulfilled adult life, and in some cases is actually killing them and destroying them. And that makes me angry. And so, anyway, it makes me angry. Another thing they've done for me is they've taught me what the hardest part of being homeless is. I always thought the hardest part of being homeless was not having a bed for the night, but it's not. You get used to it. You know, finding a doorway or a broken down building, you actually can get used to it. It's not comfortable, but you get used to it. Then I thought the hardest part of being homeless was being hungry or cold during the daytime. But it's not. You get used to that. And then I thought, well, it must be the boredom of every day, having nowhere to go and nothing to do, and usually no money in your pocket. But it's not. You get used to that as well. So what's the hardest part of being homeless? We had a guy who lived with us for a few years. When he was 18, he left us, and he went to live with his girlfriend. After about 12 months, they split up, and he went onto the streets, because he had nowhere else to go. After a couple of months in the streets, he threw himself into the Liffey. To his dismay, he was rescued, and he was brought to hospital. And I went up to see him in the hospital. He said, Peter, he said, I can't go on living like this. And I said to him, what do you mean, living like what? And he said, I can't go on living knowing that nobody cares. That's the hardest part of being homeless. To know if you disappeared off the streets of Dublin there, nobody would even notice you were gone. Never mind care. Your life has no meaning, it has no value to anybody else. You have totally lost your self-esteem, you have totally lost any sense of your own value, you have totally lost your dignity. And it's living with that 24/7, the belief that you are of no value. That's the hardest part of being homeless. So what are we doing in working with homeless young people? Yeah, we give them accommodation, we give them drug treatment, we give them counselling, we do all that. But what we're really trying to do is to give them the message that they are just as important and just as valuable as anybody else. And if we're not giving them that message, we may as well pack up and go home, because the rest isn't worth it. It's about giving people back a sense of their own dignity, sense of their own value. And you do that in so many little ways. A birthday card. Birthday card to a homeless person means so much. You actually remembered my birthday. They can't believe it. You actually remembered my birthday. They're important enough for me to remember birthday. And usually when homeless people come back maybe a few years later to thank us, or come back to see us and they say thanks, what is it they thank us for? It's not so much thanks for getting me somewhere to live or thanks for helping me to get off drugs. It's thanks for being there for me when I needed you. It's thanks for the relationship. A relationship in which they felt cared for, in which they felt they were important, in which they felt they were not being judged. That's what they remember most, and that's what they have valued most from the services that we offer them. One of the questions homeless people say to me is, why do you bother with the likes of us? Now you can hear the zero self-esteem in that question. And it reminds me of a question Jesus was asked, but he was asked it by the Pharisees. Why do you bother with the likes of them? Them being the tax collectors and the sinners. And the answer is the same, because every single one of us has the dignity of being a child of God. And no one and nothing can take that dignity away from us. And so in reaching out to the tax collectors and the sinners, Jesus was affirming their dignity as children of God. And so homeless people have that same dignity. And they deserve the love and the care of the rest of society because they are human beings. One young fellow said to me, he said, the very thought there might be a God depresses me. And I was wondering what he meant. I'm used to young people telling me they don't believe in God. That's sort of par for the course these days. But the very thought there might be a God depresses me. And I came to understand what he meant. He felt so bad about himself. He felt he was no good. He felt he wasn't worth caring about. He felt he was unlovable. Now, how did he come to feel that? Well, that's the message he was getting from everybody around him. His family didn't want him. They didn't care about him. Message is, you're not worth caring about. The school suspended him because he was difficult. Of course, if you have problems at home, you can't go into school and sit there and focus and concentrate on the lessons and go back home and do your homework. You're sitting there in class and your mind is somewhere else. Is me dad going to beat me ma up tonight again? I wonder, are my parents out in the pub? Will there be a dinner there when I go home? Your mind is elsewhere. So the school eventually anyway got rid of him. So the message he got from the school was, we don't want you, you're no good. Message he gets from the police, they keep hassling him on the street. Move on now, we don't want you here, you're only trouble, move on. Message he's getting is, you're no good. Message he gets from the church is that he's no good. Because the church says, if you rob, that's bad. And he says, oh, well, I rob, so I must be bad. Church says, if you take drugs, that's bad. He says, oh, well, I take drugs, so I must be bad. So the message is a big question mark around what the church says. That's another question. Anyway, the message he's getting from everywhere is, I'm no good. I'm unlovable, not worth caring about. And so he says to himself, if there's a God up there, God is looking down at me. And God is saying, there's someone I couldn't love. Because that's what he believed was the truth about himself. And so he says, it's bad enough going through life thinking you're unlovable, but to have to go through eternity thinking you're unlovable, that's too much. So for him, the good news is there is no afterlife, there is no God. When you die, the pain is all over. And so I say, our job really is in communicating to them that they are lovable. And that takes a long, long time, because there's huge barriers up to preventing them hearing that. So communicating to them that they are lovable, so that maybe in time they can come to say, well, maybe there is a God who loves me. So the God who is inaccessible to homeless people, who feel so bad about themselves. One of the questions sometimes social workers say to me, do I ever talk to them about God? And I say no. And they look at me as if I had two heads. And they say, but you should be talking to them about God. You're a priest, aren't you? And I say, look, I can't talk to them about God. Because when I use the word God, what do I mean? I mean a being who loves them with an infinite and an unconditional love. When they hear the word God, what do they hear? They hear judgment, condemnation. And so we're using the same word God in two totally contradictory meanings. And so I say, look, I can't talk to them about God, but I hope we communicate God to them. How do you communicate to somebody a God who loves them? Why, you do it by loving them, not by talking about it. And I hope that's what we do. I think that's what we do for many of them in the work that we are doing. That we are communicating to them that they are lovable. And therefore we are communicating to them a God who loves them. When Jesus was here, Jesus proclaimed a different God to the God of the religious authorities of his time. They proclaimed a God of the law. And Jesus came and proclaimed a God of compassion. How do you proclaim a God of the law? Why, you tell people what they have to do to obey the law of God. How do you proclaim a God of compassion? You can only proclaim a God of compassion by being the compassion of God. And that's what Jesus was in his time. And that's what I hope we are doing in working with homeless young people. I'm going to shut up there for a moment anyway, and invite you to ask a question or make a comment or criticize anything I've said. Please feel free to do that.